Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. What is up, Wildsiders? I hope that you guys had a fabulous weekend, Easter weekend, with your family, and hopefully your family gatherings didn't end in what we are going to explore in this case today.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, everybody, it is interview week, and hopefully we are kind of back on the wagon. It's been really chaotic between our schedules and even the people we've reached out to and their schedules. It's just been a really busy quarter. But this week we got to interview a wonderful human being. Her name is Sab, and she chose to remain fairly anonymous for the interview because of her persecutors that are still alive and well. And I think we get into it in the interview, but Sab actually was a listener and reached out and just was giving us, some kudos, especially for the sexual assault nurse examiner episode. And long story short, she agreed to be interviewed. And the theme this week is honor-based violence, honor killings.
And if you're having questions on what that is, don't worry, because we will obviously do a deep dive into that. In this case, we will also allow Sab to give some firsthand experience. But, Bailey and I really want to bring awareness right through this platform. And that's kind of been our motivation, our focus since we started this. And I hope that you guys realize what is happening still to this day in the world around you and in possibly your communities. So
yeah, this is a great education for anybody, especially any of you professionals out there that work with the general population.
Yeah.
And so today, you guys, we are diving into the absolute barbaric, horrific case of Shafilea Ahmed. In some parts of the world, violence is carried out in the name of honor, a belief that a person's actions can bring shame upon their family or their whole community. This often leads to what we know as honor killings, acts of violence, even murder, where the victim is blamed for violating cultural or family expectations. These acts are seen in a way to restore the family's reputation, but in all reality, it's just murder in disguise.
In this case is a tragic intersection of family loyalty, cultural expectations, and generational conflict. Shafilea Ahmed's story is one of a teenage girl caught between two worlds. And as she tried to assert her own identity and make choices for her life, she faced insurmountable pressure from her family to conform to their cultural values. This tragic case speaks volumes about how cultural expectations can go so horribly wrong and with deadly consequences.
Now, to really, really understand the case of Shafilea Ahmed, we first need to look at the complex cultural backdrop of her family, especially regarding her father, Iftikhar Ahmed. His background and experiences shaped not only his worldview, but also the suffocating pressures that would define Shafilea's existence. Iftikhar's life, like Shafelea's would be, was a balancing act between the cultural expectations of his Pakistani heritage and the more liberal values he learned from and grew into from the West. For Iftikhar, like many immigrant families from traditional conservative backgrounds, the clash between the old world and new world created immense pressure. The weight of these cultural pressures usually manifests in extreme ways, especially when it comes to maintaining family honor. And you guys are going to hear that over and over. For Iftikhar's family, the concept of honor was prioritized over literally everything else. Your love for your kids, your love for your spouse, everything. He was raised within a belief system that was forged in the strictest traditions, where anything perceived as a break from the cultural norm, especially by women, was absolutely not tolerated. Understanding Iftikhar's upbringing and the way his past experiences shaped his actions helps us understand why Shafelea's desire for independence would come to be seen as a direct threat, and a threat that ultimately led to a horrific and irreversible act.
Now, even though this story has a very specific cultural background, I do want to challenge our listeners to perceive ways in which you have experienced this, or maybe you have seen this in your own life or in your own communities. Iftikhar Ahmed's life began in a small village in Uttam, nestled in Pakistan. He grew up speaking Punjabi and was raised in the Sunni branch of Islam. But his journey was destined to take him far from his roots. At just 10 years old, Iftikhar's family moved to the UK, seeking new opportunities and a different life. Years down the road, life led him in an unforeseen direction, straight to Denmark. In Denmark, Iftikhar came into his own, embracing Western culture with enthusiasm. He was cheerful and sociable, often found dancing, enjoying a beer, or lighting up the local discos. One evening, Iftikhar joined some of his friends at a party, not knowing his life was about to change. The moment he arrived, he was captivated by a striking Danish woman named Vivi Lone Andersen. Despite their differences, with Vivi being Danish and Christian, Iftikhar fell hard. The two quickly became inseparable. Their love surprised many and challenged the cultural expectations that had long shaped Iftikhar's world. But neither he nor Vivi cared. What they had was real, and that was all that mattered. They wanted to spend their life together and decided to commit to each other despite the potential backlash or consequences from their respective families, religions, and cultures. By 1980, they were married in a civil ceremony in Copenhagen, and soon after they welcomed a son, Tony. The growing family seemed to be on track for a happy life, but as much as Iftikhar and Vivi tried to build a life together, Iftikhar's family proved to be a major obstacle in their relationship. His family, especially the men, just could not accept his relationship with Vivi, who was a non-Muslim woman.
In 1985, after living in Denmark for several years, Iftikhar Ahmed received a letter from his family in Pakistan. And it was a letter that would change pretty much the course of history in this case. He told his wife Vivi that his mother was very sick and that he needed to return to Pakistan immediately. And so Iftikhar left, and when he arrived, he was met with what you could dare say to be a cultural intervention. His family, who were appalled and angered by his separation from his cultural roots, insisted that he marry his cousin Farzana. Iftikhar was torn between his happy life with his wife Vivi and his son, and the extreme pressures from his family. The situation even escalated when Farzana threatened suicide if he refused to marry her, leaving Iftikhar with essentially no choice but to comply with the arranged marriage. Iftikhar and his new second wife, Farzana, ended up leaving Pakistan and returned to the UK. Now, mind you, Vivi is in Denmark with their son, thinking that he is just going on a family visit. Months later, now it's May of 1986, Vivi and their son Tony finally heard the news they were hoping for. Iftikhar was back in the UK and wanted them to come and join him there in a town called Bradford. It was supposed to be a fresh start for their small family unit. Vivi and Tony moved in with Iftikhar to begin building their new life together in the UK. But it didn't take long before Vivi was introduced to a heavily pregnant woman living under the same roof, Farzana. Vivi, understanding Iftikhar's culture, just assumed that this was another relative of her husband's, just a family member who was going to be staying with them temporarily until she got settled onto her own 2 feet. But that assumption was completely shattered when a health visitor came to the house to check in on this heavily pregnant woman. And it was during this health check that Vivi learned the truth. Her husband, Iftikhar, was the father of Farzana's unborn child.
The revelation rocked Vivi to her core. I mean, right. Iftikhar, unable to keep up the lie any longer, confessed. He told her that he had traveled to Pakistan. He was forced into fulfilling the demands of his family by entering into an arranged marriage with Farzana, which was a woman to whom Iftikhar's family had promised Iftikhar to when both were children. Vivi, now completely disillusioned, was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. She had believed in their life together, but Iftikhar's confession revealed that for him, family obligations and honor took precedence over everything else. In one of their final conversations, Iftikhar told Vivi that he could leave Tony, their son, to grow up without his influence because he was a boy. But if they had had a daughter, his daughter, he could not allow her to grow up without his guidance in the Islamic way. In his mind, his cultural and religious beliefs demanded complete control over the lives of his children, especially the girls. Vivi, at that moment, just knew she could not stay in this new life, built on lies and control. So just after a month of her returning to the UK, she made the heartbreaking decision to return home, where she would raise their son Tony without Iftikhar or the future she had imagined. Vivi filed for divorce and settled back in Denmark, while Iftikhar and Farzana settled into their new life in the UK. But the story didn't end there. Iftikhar and Farzana had given birth to a daughter, Shafilea Ahmed, on the 14th of July, 1986. As Iftikhar distanced himself from the westernized lifestyle he had briefly embraced, he fully immersed himself in his cultural and religious roots. This meant that Shafilea would not be allowed to grow up without strict Islamic guidance, something that would drastically shift the course of his life and his family's future. Soon after Shafilea was born, the Ahmeds moved to Warrington, Cheshire, a town where the Asian community had long been established. It was a fresh start, but one filled with deep-rooted culture, and with that came extreme and demanding expectations. As Shafilea grew up, she was immersed in two worlds: the strict culture within her family system and the very westernized UK. She attended school and made friends easily. She was outgoing, popular, and thrived at school. Despite this, Shafelea's life at home was much more isolated and driven by demands, expectations, and fear. Beneath the surface of a family that seemed outwardly normal, a dark reality was beginning to take shape.
Now, growing up, Shafilea was independent and wanted more for her life than arranged marriages and submission. She was a bit of a free spirit influenced by the freedom of the westernized UK in which she had grown up. That was really all she had known. But this was not something that was allowed of her. At any slightest disagreement or decision outside of her cultural boundaries determined by her parents, Shafilea was subjected to both physical and emotional abuse. By the time Shafilea was just 11 years old, she had had enough. One day, March 10th of 1998, Shafilea and her younger sister ran away from home. I think most of us have always had the attempts of running away from home. I ran away to the closest stop sign, ate through my bag of Doritos, and realized I couldn't make it on my own. And I went back home. But this is absolutely not the same situation. As she and her sister were gone, Iftikhar and Farzana ended up calling the police to report their two girls missing. But by the end of the day, the two sisters were back home. They were back in the rigid and controlling nature of their parents. The controlling environment that had a thumb on what they wore, who their friends were, and how they would always maintain the honor of the family. Now fast forward to October 3rd of 2002. Shafelea's teachers begin to notice something disturbing. She had not been showing up to class, which was really concerning because Shafilea loved school and was highly academic. When staff members asked around as to why Shafilea had not been at school, they learned that Shafilea was being kept at home, forced into isolation. The staff members decide to approach Iftikhar, and after a brief conversation, he reluctantly allows Shafilea to return to school. But he is not happy, and the underlying tension was palpable. It's clear that something is wrong, but no one really knew the extent of the situation or even the extent of the abuse that Shafilea and her siblings were facing at home. Iftikhar and Farzana threatened Shafilea with a knife to try to scare her into submission and would banish her to a room without food for days on end. The kind of abuse you read about in crime novels was an everyday occurrence for Shafilea. As the abuse worsened, Shafilea was at her ultimate breaking point, and by November of 2002, she ran away again. She was desperate to escape the control and abuse she was facing at home, and so homelessness and uncertainty in her mind was better than the hell she was facing at her parents' hands at home. When Iftikhar and Farzana realized she had run away again, they again contacted the police and reported her missing. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Shafilea was found sitting in a park with her bags packed. And after having spent just one night at her friend's house, she reluctantly agrees to meet with her parents, and after a conversation, she returns back home.
But yet again, this didn't last long. Shafilea was tortured by straddling two worlds: the traditional values of her Pakistani heritage and the freedom of life in Britain. She was experiencing mounting pressure on her to conform to the family's values, to her father's rigid expectations, and to the unspoken rules that come with being part of a traditional immigrant family. Shafilea had dreams of continuing her education. She wanted to go to school to be a lawyer, but this wasn't a possibility under her parents' roof. Unable to manage this boiling pressure, by February 3rd, 2003, Shafilea had run away again, this time staying with friends. The pressure at home was becoming unbearable, and she sought refuge wherever she could. But soon after, Shafelea's desperate need for help caught the attention of social services. Pleading for a safe place to live, she even told them in a matter-of-fact tone that she felt homeless. The Warrington Council acted quickly, placing her in emergency hotel accommodations. But it wasn't just a temporary escape. Shafilea had a harrowing story to tell. When she spoke to social services, she revealed the extent of the domestic violence she had endured. The abuse, she said, had only worsened in the months leading up to her decision to leave. In her counsel application, she recounted a chilling scene. Quote, "One parent would hold me while the other hit me." She explained how the violence had been triggered by the friends she kept, who were white girls, her music, her non-traditional clothes, and her parents' suspicions that she was in contact with boys. But Shafelea's fears weren't just about the violence she faced in the home. As a young woman, she feared an even darker fate. She was terrified that if returned home, her parents would force her into a marriage in Pakistan, a forced, arranged marriage, just as so many young women in her community had been subjected to. She knew that if they got their way, she would be taken away, trapped in a life where her voice, her autonomy, would be completely stripped away. Despite the urgency of her situation, social services were slow to respond. Her pleas for help seemed to fall on deaf ears, leaving Shafilea increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She had sought refuge, but it was clear the system wasn't moving fast enough to provide the protection she so desperately needed. And the clock was ticking as Shafelea's situation grew more dangerous by the day.
Now, I think it's safe to say that even at this time in the early 2000s, social services likely didn't really understand just how much danger Shafilea was actually in. And therefore, she was back to essentially square one without much support. She was swiftly recaptured, essentially, drug off the street and forced into her car. A week later, Iftikhar knew that Shafilea had to be sorted out, to have her westernized ideas removed and be married off. He told Shafilea and the children that they would be heading to Pakistan, but the guise was for a family wedding. And so the night before Shafilea and her father and two siblings were to leave for Pakistan, her mother Farzana brought Shafilea a drink in bed. Shafilea, thinking that the drink was a kind gesture from her mother, did not know that she had been drugged. After drinking the drink, Shafilea became very complicit, which was a description her sibling gave. And that continued into the next day at the airport, with Shafilea leaning on luggage just to stand up and support herself. Now, under this guise of a vacation or a trip to see the family, Iftikhar and the family arrives to Pakistan, and they stay for several weeks. But by March 19th of 2003, Iftikhar returns to the UK with the two younger siblings, but Shafilea did not go with them. She was left in Pakistan to, as it is believed, abide by an arranged marriage to a cousin. All of her fears were becoming true. Her father canceled her £250 return ticket, a transaction that symbolized how little Shafelea's future actually mattered to those she once called family. Now, there is still a little bit of speculation as to what exactly transpired when she was back in Pakistan, but again, it is believed that Shafilea was in this situation of being forced into this marriage to a cousin, but she likely rejected the proposal. And so with this comes punishment. She's totally trapped in an unfamiliar place and in the center of a rigid cultural control. So she becomes desperate. In a cry for help, she actually attempts suicide by drinking bleach. This ended up causing some serious problems for her, making it difficult for her to eat, drink, and swallow. And after drinking bleach, her condition continued to deteriorate to such an extent that she was no longer deemed as being wanted as a bride, which likely brought shame to Iftikhar and the family. Now, due to all of these factors, on May 27th of that year, Iftikhar flew Shafilea back to the UK, because at this point, she was an undesirable, which brought tremendous shame to the family. She is taken to the hospital in an ambulance after her father calls 999. She's rushed to the intensive care because she is just deteriorating. The severity of her injuries, emotional and physical, were becoming absolutely impossible to ignore. Iftikhar conveyed that the reason that she drank bleach was it was an accident, right? They had reused a bottle of mouthwash and filled it with bleach, and she unknowingly drank it during like a power outage. But I think we all know that this is crap. The truth was much worse. Shafilea spent 8 weeks in Warrington Hospital, and her weight plummeted to 5 stone. And it was there where she ended up speaking to a fellow patient named Foisa Aslam. And according to Foisa, Shafilea told her, "You don't know what they did to me there." She said her father and mother had accepted a rishta, or a formal marriage offer, to her cousin, adding, "I don't even like this guy." She also claimed that they had taken her passport. They had trapped her. An Asian nurse at the hospital was warned by Iftikhar to tell the white nurses not to give information about his daughter to anyone other than her parents. She described the Ahmeds as a, quote, loveless family, and the children, she noticed, were too frightened to speak. So after several weeks, almost 2 months in the hospital, Shafilea was discharged, and she does her best to move on from the horrific experiences of her trip to Pakistan. Determined to carve her own path and to really show just how resilient this teenage girl was, in September of that year, Shafilea decides that she was not going to be a victim, and she begins a new chapter. She enrolls at Priestley College, determined to build a future for herself. On top of that, she secures a part-time job at the ManWeb call center in Warrington, and she starts doing everything in her power to distance herself from the control and fear she had lived with her entire life. She had endured immense abuse, especially in the past 5 years, and she was only 17 years old. But in just under 2 weeks, Shafilea Ahmed would disappear, with everyone searching for answers.
For Shafilea, the transition wasn't just geographical. It was a cultural minefield. Little did Shafilea know the very struggle for her independence would set off a chain of events that would lead to a tragic, heartbreaking end. But in those early years, all she had were the hopes of a brighter future and the desire to break free from a life defined by control. On the evening of September 11th, 2003, after finishing her shift at the call center, Shafilea made her way home. Among arriving home, Shafilea and her parents began to fight. Iftikhar and Farzana were furious that Shafilea was wearing a short-sleeved V-neck shirt, no sweater, and tight trousers, her choice of Western clothes. They were furious about her behavior and how it was bringing shame to the family. As the other children stood paralyzed by fear, the argument escalated into a violent struggle between Shafilea and her father. She was forced down onto the settee while fighting willfully against her father. It was a scene too absolutely horrific to imagine. A father holding down his daughter with brute strength while her mother, cold and detached, watched. Then, Farzana issued the command in Urdu, "Just finish it here." Iftikhar held Shafilea down, and both parents began to shove a plastic bag into her mouth, suffocating her. Shafilea's eyes were wide open in terror, the horror of the moment reflected in her panicked gaze. Her legs kicked in protest, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating grasp of those she loved. But there was no escape. Her movements grew weaker, slower, until her legs stopped kicking altogether. She was dead. As Shafilea's body lay still, lifeless, her father's anger turned into violence. He began punching her lifeless body in the chest, as though the beating would erase the sin he believed she had committed. There was no remorse, only rage at the daughter who had disgraced the family. Meanwhile, Farzana, Shafilea's mother, moved with cold precision to the kitchen. She prepared the tools: sheets, bin bags, rolls of tape. Her hands worked methodically, as though this was just another chore, another task to be done. The room felt colder, darker, as the sinister nature of their plan took shape. And then, through the window, the final image. Iftikhar carrying a heavy package. It was wrapped in a way that was unmistakable. The shape, the weight, the way he held it. It was her body. Shafilea's younger sister, Alicia, watched, knowing in her gut what had happened. It was also a horrific realization that this could happen to her too, if she were not to obey.
Now, I want to take a minute and just kind of reflect on what has happened so far. Shafilea's murder was not the result of a single moment, but a climax of years of emotional manipulation and control. Her father, Iftikhar, wielded his authority with an iron grip, especially when it came to his daughters. And we talk about this a lot with Sab in our interview about the differences between sons and daughters and how they're treated. And for the Ahmeds, Shafilea's behavior was seen as a direct challenge, and not in a good way, to her family's honor. Over the years, she was subjected, as we had talked about, to relentless abuse. Every move she made was scrutinized, criticized, and suffocated by her father's expectations. Her refusal to conform, and I want us to think about this, everything that we've talked about is simply because Shafilea had higher hopes for herself, and she did not want to conform. And this was at the center of the issue. The night Shafilea was murdered was the tipping point. After that fierce argument, the psychological toll of years of manipulation erupted into a brutal act of violence. To her parents, especially her father, the murder was not a tragedy. It was a form of punishment to restore their tarnished honor that Shafilea had brought. Her actions were seen as a betrayal, and thus it was deemed unforgivable. In their minds, this was the only way to reassert control over their lives and their reputation. They had to silence the rebellion. In honor-based killings, the perpetrator, and in this case, Shafilea's parents, often convinces themselves that they are justified, acting as though they are protecting the family name. And what's really troubling, especially in this case, is the distorted reality that Iftikhar lived in. To him, he wasn't committing a murder. He was restoring his family's honor.
From a sociological perspective, Shafilea's life was an impossible balancing act, right? She found herself trapped between two worlds, one shaped by her family's traditional values and one that was formed by the culture she encountered in Britain. Her parents, again, who were immigrants from Pakistan, held tightly to customs that emphasized family honor, respect for elders, and rigid gender roles. In contrast, Shafilea longed for the freedom and self-expression that British society valued so highly. Her desire to be herself, to be free, was seen as a betrayal, not just of her parents, but of the very cultural foundation that they had built their lives upon. This clash of cultures, it created an unbearable tension, right? So for Shafilea, honor wasn't just an abstract concept. It truly was a form of imprisonment. As her parents' expectations weighed heavily on her, she was caught in this tug of war between the old world of her family's traditions and the new world of individualism, independence, and freedom. The struggle to reconcile these two forces would shape the course of her life, ultimately leading her down a path, like we've talked about, of heartbreaking consequences.
On September 11th, 2003, Shafilea Ahmed was murdered by those who should have loved her most, her parents. And it wasn't until a week later, on September 18th, that her disappearance was officially reported. Joanne Code, Shafilia's former teacher, had overheard the growing concern among Shafilia's younger siblings and school friends about her well-being. Troubled by what she heard, she took it upon herself to alert the authorities. When authorities got involved, they learned that this was not the first time that Shafilea had run away, right? She was a high runaway risk because of her history. But I think that the investigators, the police, were starting to really pick up on some of the indicators of honor-based violence in this family system. And so within a month, Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed, along with 5 other family members, were arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice. They were not cooperating, right? But there was no evidence to confirm that a crime had been committed. I mean, there was no body, there was no blood, there was no nothing. So they were released without charge. But the interesting thing is, almost immediately after Shafilia's disappearance, a widespread campaign was launched, urging anyone with information regarding her disappearance to step forward. Actress Shobna Gulati even led the media efforts, poignantly reading some of Shafilia's poems on television, which brought this story to kind of the public's center attention. A nationwide search ensued, looking for the missing Shafilea. But as the investigation deepened, the realization of what likely happened started to take shape. And so we fast forward to February 4th, 2004. The River Kent in Sedgwick, Cumbria, had just receded after a recent flood. Now, the river was more than 70 miles from Warrington, a distance so far it seemed like another world. And on that day, 3 workmen were wading through the aftermath of the flood, gripping their tools, walking through, and their eyes stumbled upon something that would change everything. Tucked away in the muddy banks of the river was what appeared to be parts of a human body, partially submerged in the frigid water. At first glance, it seemed like a mere victim of the river's unforgiving current. But as they approached, the grim reality started to sink in. Immediately, the men contacted authorities, who arrived on scene.
Upon arrival, the scene was cordoned off, and the river's muddy banks became the focal point for a thorough forensic investigation. But the advanced decomposition of the body made it impossible to determine the cause of death, only that the body was that of a young female, and that the condition of the remains made it impossible to draw any concrete conclusions. Authorities speculated that the body was that of Shafilea Ahmed and had likely been left in the river around the time Shafilea vanished, or perhaps just after. Shafilea's dentist, upon reviewing the remains, was 90% certain that the lower jaw found in the river belonged to her, based on her dental work Shafilea had previously undergone. Her story had been silenced in the most brutal way. but the truth was starting to resurface. Weeks after, on February 23, 2004, DNA testing all but assured authorities that the remains belonged to a 17-year-old Shafilea Ahmed. The grim details piled up. Dr. Allison Armour, a home office pathologist, determined that the cause of death, again, was clear. It was no accident. Parts of Shafilia's skull were missing, and there were no signs of blood on her clothing. Dr. Armour ruled out natural causes and drowning and pointed to the most likely cause of death as smothering or strangulation, either with a ligature manual strangulation or possibly a combination of both. The pieces were coming together, but the true horror had yet to be revealed.
I cannot begin to imagine shoving a plastic bag down your own daughter's throat, punching her in the chest, and then dismembering her, all in the name of protecting your honor. But at this point in the investigation, no one knew what had happened to Shafilea. Was this a runaway? Did she turn to sex work? Was this just a crazed killer? The questions that had plagued investigators for months, at least at this point, now had a face. They knew it was Shafilea. The discovery of her body launched the full-scale murder investigation. It was during their investigation, though, that police soon discovered that Iftikhar had failed to seek medical attention for Shafilia's injured throat. And this made them uneasy. They grew increasingly convinced that her family was somehow involved in her death. They began to suspect that she wasn't a victim of a random act of violence, but probably more of an honor killing, an act of violence rooted in the shame and family control. But again, they just did not have any evidence tying the Ahmeds to the murder of their daughter. And it would take 9 years before Shafilea's sister provided the final piece of the puzzle about her sister's death. Kind of in a weird twist of fate, this break came on August 25th, 2010, when Shafilea's younger sister, Alicia, was arrested. Alicia had apparently orchestrated a robbery at her own parents' home. And on the day of the robbery, Alicia, her brother, her sisters, and parents were in the house when 3 masked men broke in and tied up her mother, her 2 sisters, and brother. Alicia was immediately arrested and taken down to the police station. And while she was there, after about 6 days of being in custody, she dropped the bombshell on police. In an interview on August 31st, Alicia Ahmed had shared how she had been carrying a devastating secret for 7 long years, and finally had the relief to be telling the truth. During the interview, Alicia revealed how she watched her parents hold down and murder her older sister Shafilea for essentially rebelling against their cultural expectations with going to college, having non-Muslim friends, and being interested in boys.
Just 3 days after Alicia finally broke her silence on September 2nd, 2010, Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed were arrested on suspicion of murdering their daughter. The news sent shockwaves through the public. Though they were released on bail pending further investigation, the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn.
Now, I just want to kind of do a quick thing here, and I know you guys are kind of getting saturated with education, but it's so important. I just want for all of us to take note that the psychological fallout from this event didn't just affect Shafilea's family, it rippled into the community and the world. This was really the first global rock that was thrown into this lake, and the ripples started to just grow and grow. The idea that a family member and your parents could justify taking their child's life in the name of honor, people couldn't wrap their heads around it. And what caught people even more was the fact that the family seemed proud of their decision, lacking remorse in murdering their child. They initially played the part of the grieving parents, reporting her missing and yada yada, attending her funeral. But their grief was really nothing more than a mask. The lack of empathy and guilt is just a really horrible example of arguably the psychopathic type of detachment where the perpetrator is so disconnected from the crime that they can move forward without any sort of guilt or remorse.
And the sociological implications are also profound, right? Like, this case highlights the danger of rigid cultural structures that prioritize family honor over individual rights. And again, I know that this is a very culturally specific case, but I do think that we have instances of this within our communities still, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are aspects of this. It might not be to the same degree, but, a rigid cultural structure just does not produce very many beneficial outcomes, right? And this one, right, prioritizing the family honor over Shafelea's rights, it didn't happen in isolation. This is part of a larger pattern of honor-based violence. And again, it's a phenomenon seen in various cultures where women, particularly women, are expected to adhere to strict behavioral codes or face violent retributions. And in some cases, culture can be used as a weapon to silence those who refuse to conform.
Yeah, it's really awful. And I really hope you guys stick around on Friday to listen to the interview with Sap. But so what we know, right? Shafilea was murdered. Her dismembered body was found, thrown out like garbage. And luckily, her parents were arrested in September of 2010. But the trial didn't happen until September 7th, 2011, when police formally charged the Ahmeds with the murder of their daughter, Shafilea. The trial began in May of 2012 at Chester Crown Court, almost a decade after the bright, determined teenager had vanished from her family home. As the trial unfolded, shocking new details emerged. Farzana changed her story, fired her legal team, and turned on her husband, claiming that he had attacked their daughter and that she had tried to intervene but was met with violence herself, which, quite frankly, pisses me off because wouldn't this bring shame to your family, Farzana? Does this mean that you too should be killed? It's wild. Her reversal did little to spare either of them, though. And by August of 2012, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Thankfully, Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed were found guilty of the murder of their own daughter, and on August 3rd, they were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. In the scathing words, the judge said, quote, "Your concern about being shamed in your community was greater than the love of your child. You chose to raise your family in Warrington, but the values you enforced were those of a world far removed from the one your daughter was born into. Shafilea wanted a life that was normal for the town, the country, and the time that she lived in. And for that, she paid with her life."
Alicia, who had bravely come forward, testified that Shafilea had lived a double life, trying to balance, and I am not laughing, but the fact that you can consider what she was doing as living a double life is so bizarre to me, right? Like, this should be everybody's just normal life, right? Autonomy, respect, ambitions. I'll digress, but according to Alicia, she was living a double life, trying to balance the oppressive demands of her parents with a longing to simply be a teenager. And if you guys have not caught on to the fact that she was a 17-year-old young woman, I want you to remember this. She was 17. She was a teenager.
She wasn't even a woman. She was a girl. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes, that's true. And Bailey always does such a good job of reminding us that we say words like young woman. She was a girl. She was a minor.
She was a teenager. She was a minor.
Teenager. Ugh. She had male friends. She wore Western clothes. She wanted to choose her own path. And for that, she was locked in rooms without food, threatened with knives, and ultimately suffocated in front of her siblings. Her friend Melissa, who had waited nearly 10 years to seek justice done, stood outside the courtroom and said what so many people were thinking. Shafilea was a caring, high-spirited, and brave young woman. She had a great sense of humor, a beautiful smile, and a heart that looked out for others, even in her darkest days. We watched her killers walk free for years, but today we heard those powerful words, guilty. And finally, Shafilea got the justice she so deeply deserved. And if you guys know me, you know that I really love any time that history is changed and the future is changed because of horrific events, and they're changed in a positive way. And in the UK, each year on July 14th, Shafelea's birthday, it is now a national day of memory that is held to honor victims of honor-based violence. It's a crime rooted in control, fear, and misplaced tradition. A crime meant to silence. But Shafelea's story didn't stay silent. And because of her and the courage of those who finally spoke, others may find the strength to break free. Her life was stolen, but her voice lives on in memory, in legacy, and in every young woman who dares to choose her own future.
Shafilea Ahmed's story is much more than just the tragedy. Unfortunately, it's a warning, a reminder of what happens when family honor is valued above a child's life. Her death sparked urgent conversations about culture, control, and the right to choose your own path. In remembering her, we are called to protect those still caught in the silence and to never let the fear of tradition justify that violence. And that is the awful case of Shafilea Ahmed, who was 17 years young when she was murdered by her parents. And with that, you guys, I know we've said it 100 times in this episode, but please make sure to tune in on Friday for our interview with Sab. She educates us about honor-based violence, honor killings, cultural standards, expectations, hypocrisy, all of it. You get to hear me ask her what she was saying, and it was just her British accent, and I felt super silly, but we're keeping that in. And you also hear me get really angry at how just unfair this shit is. So, yeah, sure.
And here's the deal. I hope that you guys, just by listening to us and listening to the cases that we cover, we truly respect different cultures, different ideologies. There's a lot of beauty, right? Like, I don't put Western culture on a pedestal. So I hope that you don't feel that this is, essentially a tug of war of, which culture is better. This is more of just the blatant disregard of a human life, right? Like, it doesn't matter what culture it's from, what background it's from. Murder is murder. And you can't...
And it should be justified for whatever reason you pick that day from, fill in which bubble from the box.
Right. And again, Sab talks about this kind of this wishy-washy, like ever-evolving standard that is seen a lot of times in her culture. And, it's cases like this. And then I actually just finished reading a book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I'm so sorry if I butchered that name. You guys know I'm not great at pronunciations of names, but it's entitled We Should All Be Feminist. And I'm not going to go on a feminist rant, but I want us, so often in a Western culture, I think that we don't have a comprehensive understanding of words like, feminist, or words or phrases like honor-based killing, and what that means for other people and what that means for other cultures. And again,
sorry.
I was just going to say, I really challenge, all of us to look at some of these words that in our Western culture, we might not have, it might not leave a good taste in our mouth, or we might have misunderstandings around it, and to kind of broaden our view on that.
Yeah.
Right? Because in this, I think it's absolutely imperative that we stand up for the rights of women. Like in Shafelea's situation, she was being targeted, again, because of the fact that she was born a female into a culture that did not prioritize her as an individual and set, these absolutely ridiculous demands on her. And I feel like that's something that should be we should bring awareness to that. We should understand what that looks like for our neighbors, for our community members, for our sisters, right? For our people.
And for everybody here listening who is like, you feel so oppressed by whatever is going on in the world and, women's rights and this, like, I think you should start a gratitude list. And by that gratitude list, starting off with arguably being in a culture, an atmosphere, potentially a religion that doesn't have the green light to kill you if you wear clothes that they don't agree with, or having ambitions to go to college for a career for yourself. You know what I mean? Right. So get out your journal, make a gratitude list for how progressive we are. Sure, there's always room for improvement, but we do also have to recognize the other ends of the spectrum. So we'll leave that with you guys. As always, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride.
And we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.